Welcome back. Settle in wherever you are, get yourself comfortable, and let tonight be one of those nights where you don't have to think too hard about anything at all. We're going to talk about something I genuinely love, and I think by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why. We're going to spend tonight inside one of the most specific and quietly brilliant traditions that any television show has ever built. We're going to walk through every time South Park looked at a celebrity at the absolute peak of their fame, their power, their ego, and decided to say the thing out loud that everyone else was only thinking. And we're going to do it slowly, in order, from the very beginning, because the full story is a lot richer than any single episode on its own. South Park premiered on Comedy Central on August 13th, 1997. It was created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two guys from Colorado who had made a short, animated film called The Spirit of Christmas in 1995 that circulated on VHS and early internet circles and basically went viral before. Viral was a word people used for things like that. The show they built from that short was unlike anything else on television at the time. It was set in a small, fictional mountain town in Colorado, and it followed 4 elementary school kids named Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, Eric Hartman, and Kenny McCormick. And it used their adventures to talk about everything that adults in 1997 were either too polite or too nervous to say out loud. Over the years, it grew into something that now, with 28 seasons and 338 episodes under its belt as of late 2025, is one of the longest-running animated shows in television history. And in that entire run, one of the things it became most famous for was not the politics, not the religion, not even the profanity, though there was certainly plenty of all of that. It became famous for what it did to celebrities, and specifically what it did to their egos. Now, there's an important distinction to make right at the start, because South Park's approach to celebrity satire is not the same as a roast, not the same as a tabloid story, and not the same as a Twitter pile-on. Those things are about humiliation for its own sake. South Park was always after something more specific than that. What Parker and Stone were interested in, what they kept returning to across nearly 3 decades of the show, was a single idea. The idea that fame creates a particular kind of delusion. That when someone becomes famous enough, something starts to happen to the way they see themselves in the world. Something slides, and the gap between who they think they are and who they actually are becomes so wide that it starts to look almost absurd from the outside. And that gap, that specific absurdity of ego meeting reality, is what every one of the episodes we're going to talk about tonight was designed to expose. Not cruelty for the sake of cruelty. Something more like a diagnosis. We'll go through them chronologically because that matters. The show evolves. Parker and Stone got sharper. The targets got bigger. And by the time you get to the later seasons, what started as a pretty simple joke about one celebrity's vanity had become a kind of ongoing conversation about what fame does to people and what our relationship to famous people says about us. And there's a lot here. So let's begin at the very beginning. It's 1998. South Park has been on the air for less than a year. It already has a reputation for being outrageous, for being willing to go places other cartoons wouldn't. But it's still finding its feet in some ways. It's still figuring out exactly what kind of show it wants to be. And then it airs an episode in February of that year, the 12th episode of the first season. And in doing so, it establishes a template that the show would return to again and again for the next 27 years. The episode is called Mecha-Streisand, and it's about Barbra Streisand. Now, for anyone who wasn't paying attention to celebrity culture in the late 90s, or who was alive but perhaps too young to fully absorb it, Barbra Streisand by 1998 was a genuine institution. And she had been famous since the early 1960s. She'd won Academy Awards, Grammy Awards, Emmy Awards, Tony Awards. She was one of the best-selling music artists of all time. She had directed films. She had advocated for causes she believed in publicly, and sometimes very loudly. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most accomplished entertainers who had ever lived. She was also known, with some affection and some exasperation, for having an ego that matched her talent, for being particular, for being demanding, for taking herself and her legacy and her cultural significance very, very seriously. Parker and Stone clearly knew exactly what they were doing when they chose her as the show's first major celebrity target. They weren't going after someone easy, they were going after someone enormous. In the episode, our Barbra Streisand arrives in South Park. Not because she's performing there or on vacation there, she's there because she's searching for something called the Triangle of Zinthar, a magical artifact that grants its possessor enormous power. The boys have accidentally found it while digging near their school. They don't know what it is. Streisand manipulates them, flatters them, and eventually gets the triangle from them. And then she combines it with another artifact she already has, and she transforms. She transforms into a massive mechanical monster, a kaiju of sorts, a giant, robotic Barbra Streisand who begins destroying South Park. And she can only be stopped by a handful of celebrities who arrive to fight her. Leonard Maltin, the film critic who transforms into a giant creature to battle her. Sidney Poitier, the legendary actor, who also arrives to fight, and Robert Smith from the band The Cure, who delivers the killing blow and is heralded as a hero by the townspeople. Robert Smith, for the record, actually provided his own voice for that episode, making him one of the very few celebrities in South Park history to be cast as a hero rather than a villain or a buffoon. On the surface, it's silly. A kaiju Barbra Streisand. It sounds like the kind of thing you'd come up with if you were in middle school and someone dared you to write a TV episode. But what it's actually doing is something quite precise. Because the Triangle of Zinthar, this artifact that Streisand has been obsessing over and that transforms her into a monster when she gets it, is a stand-in for something real. It's fame, it's legacy. It's the thing that extremely successful people sometimes spend enormous energy trying to secure and protect and magnify. The idea that what she wants isn't just more success, but more power, more permanence, more dominance over the cultural landscape. And when she gets it, when she has everything she was reaching for, she becomes a monster. Literally, it's the show's first real articulation of what would become its central thesis about celebrity. That the drive for that kind of absolute cultural supremacy is, at a certain point, indistinguishable from megalomania. And megalomania, taken to its logical conclusion, is a kaiju tearing buildings apart with its mechanical hands. Streisand reportedly did not enjoy the episode, which is, in retrospect, about the most South Park response you could imagine getting from someone South Park made fun of. The show had barely been on the air for 6 months, and it had already found the target and hit it. What's also interesting about Mecha-Streisand, looking back at it now with the full run of the show in mind, is how it established the basic architecture that almost all of the great celebrity episodes would follow. You take something real about a person, something that people sense, something that's been discussed or whispered about in the culture but hasn't quite been named directly. You name it. You then take it to its absolute extreme. You follow the logic of it all the way to the end, no matter how absurd it gets. And in doing so, you end up saying something true about the original thing that you couldn't have said any other way. A straightforward critique of Barbra Streisand's ego would have been boring and probably mean-spirited. A kaiju Barbra Streisand destroying South Park while searching for an artifact of absolute cultural power is funny, and it's also somehow more honest. There's a moment near the end of the episode where Robert Smith destroys the mecha, and Streisand transforms back into herself and retreats into the sky. And the boys watch her go, and then they go back to whatever they were doing before she arrived. The town is in ruins around them, and they just sort of shrug and move on, which is maybe the most real thing in the whole episode, because that's more or less what happens in real life too. The celebrity does something enormous and outrageous and disproportionate. It makes a mess, and then they leave. And everyone else has to live in the wreckage for a while before things return to normal. Barbra Streisand would return, by the way. She came back in the show's landmark 200th episode, rebuilt and ready for another round. We'll get to that. But it's worth remembering that she was there at the very beginning, episode 12, season 1. Before the show knew what it would become, South Park was announcing itself with that episode. It was saying, here is what this show is going to do. It is going to look at the biggest, most famous, most culturally entrenched people in the world. And it is going to ask what happens when all of that reaches its logical extreme. And it is going to do it without blinking. That was 1998, and the show was just getting started. In the years that followed the Streisand episode, South Park continued to take aim at celebrities in various ways with varying degrees of directness. Some of those early episodes are more cultural commentary than personal satire. The show was also starting to figure out exactly how pointed it wanted to be, how specific, how willing it was to name names directly and hold people up to the light by their actual identities rather than thinly veiled versions of themselves. By the time you get to the middle of the show's run, that question had been definitively answered. The show was willing to be as direct as it wanted to be, and it was going to keep being that direct no matter who complained. But before we get to some of the show's most famous celebrity takedowns, it's worth pausing on a few episodes from the early and middle seasons that established the specific flavor of what was coming. Because what made the later episodes so effective wasn't just that they were pointed, it was that they were almost always rooted in something real, something that was actually happening in the culture at the time, something that people were already feeling or thinking about, even if they hadn't quite articulated it. And that grounding in real cultural anxiety is what separated the great celebrity episodes from the simply mean ones. Let's talk about a few of those early templates, and then we'll get into the ones that really change the conversation. Because somewhere between Mecha-Streisand in 1998 and what was coming in 2004 and 2005, South Park was quietly building towards something. It was getting better at this, sharpening the blade. And when it was ready, it aimed it squarely at one of the biggest names in the world. By the time 2004 arrived, South Park had settled into a confident rhythm. It had already been on the air for 7 years. It had already made enemies, drawn controversy, and survived all of it. Parker and Stone had learned something important in those 7 years, which was that the controversy was usually part of the point. That the discomfort the show created was often precisely where the real content lived. If something made you uncomfortable, it was worth asking why. And if a celebrity was upset about how they'd been depicted, that was usually a sign the depiction had landed somewhere close to the truth. In March of 2004, a few weeks after the theatrical release of Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ, South Park aired an episode called The Passion of the Jew. It was the 4th episode of the 8th season, and it came out on March 31st, 2004. And it did something that the show was becoming increasingly good at, which was respond to a real cultural moment with a speed and precision that felt almost impossible given the complexity of what it was trying to say. The Passion of the Christ had opened in theaters the previous month, and it was a cultural phenomenon almost immediately. It made an enormous amount of money. It was praised by millions of religious viewers. It was criticized by others for what critics called its anti-Semitic undertones and its graphic, almost fetishistic depictions of violence. And it was released at a particular moment in American culture, shortly after the September 11th attacks and the lead-up to the Iraq War, when questions of faith and identity and who was on the right side of history were very much alive in the public conversation. Gibson was everywhere. He was writing the success of a film he had financed and directed himself, a film he had believed in so deeply that he had put enormous amounts of his own money into it when no major studio would back it. And he was presenting himself as a man of profound faith, a man willing to sacrifice his reputation and his comfort for what he believed to be a sacred, artistic, and spiritual mission. South Park looked at all of that, and at Mel Gibson the man, and it made an episode in a matter of weeks. The episode splits into 3 storylines running at the same time. Kenny and Cartman go to see the film. Cartman is deeply affected, but not in the way you might hope for. He becomes energized by the film's depiction of Jewish culpability for the death of Jesus, and he immediately starts trying to use it to mobilize his neighbors into something that starts looking disturbingly like a fascist movement. He dresses in what the episode depicts as a brown uniform and begins leading people down the street. And when he tries to speak to them in German, they mistake his words for Aramaic, the language of the film. The satire there is not subtle. It's pointing directly at the question that a lot of people were already asking about what kind of audiences the film was attracting and what they were taking from it. Meanwhile, Kyle, who is Jewish, goes to see the film and comes away feeling an unexpected guilt about his heritage, a guilt that the episode treats as both understandable and completely misplaced. He goes to his rabbi in his synagogue to try to work through it, and what he finds is a community that is deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation and uncertain how to respond. And Stan and Kenny travel to Malibu to find Mel Gibson himself and demand a refund on their ticket money. They find him at his house, and what they find is not the solemn man of faith and artistic conviction that Gibson had been presenting to the world. What they find is someone completely unhinged. Gibson in the episode is a masochist. He loves pain. He's delighted when Stan punches him. He chases him through his mansion begging for more. He behaves like someone who has built an entire image around suffering and sacrifice because on some level he genuinely enjoys it. The satire is doing several things at once here. It's making a specific point about Gibson himself, about the question of whether someone can use the language of religious devotion and genuine suffering as a kind of costume, a performance that satisfies something in themselves rather than something for anyone else. But it's also making a broader point about the way the film was being consumed, about how something that presents itself as being about faith and love can end up being used for purposes that look a lot more like anger and division. Cartman marching down the street with his neighbors isn't an accident. It's a direct line from the premise of the film to a particular kind of cultural outcome. And the episode is asking the audience to look at that line and think about whether they're comfortable with where it leads. Gibson never publicly commented on the episode, which is notable given how vocal he was about the film itself and how much he seemed to care about its reception. The silence, in retrospect, says something, not necessarily about guilt or acknowledgement, but about the nature of the criticism. The episode hadn't said anything about his beliefs. It had said something about what drives a person to make a film like that, and about what happens when the film goes out into the world and meets the part of the audience that was waiting for it to arrive. That's harder to respond to than a simple insult. The Passion of the Jew is one of South Park's most politically complex episodes, and it holds up remarkably well. It was prescient about things that would continue to unfold in American culture for years afterward, and it established something that the show's best celebrity episodes always do, which is that the celebrity is a lens, not the subject. Gibson isn't the real subject of the episode. The culture that created the conditions for a film like The Passion of the Christ and the culture that consumed it is the real subject. Gibson just happens to be the clearest available window into that. 1 year later, the show aimed at someone even bigger, and it aimed harder. Season 9, Episode 12, Trapped in the Closet. It aired on November 16, 2005, and it became one of the most talked about episodes in the show's history almost immediately. It also created real-world consequences that are genuinely remarkable when you think about them. But let's start with the episode itself because it's worth walking through it carefully because there's more going on in it than it might initially seem. The setup is deceptively gentle. Stan Marsh, the show's most rational and reasonable main character, is trying to save up money for a new bike. He wanders past some Scientologists who invite him to take a free personality test, which is a very real thing that the Church of Scientology has used as a recruitment tool for decades. Stan takes the test. The auditor who reviews the results is shocked. Stan's scores are unlike anything he's ever seen. He sends the results to the Scientology home office, and within hours, the leadership of the Church of Scientology has concluded that Stan Marsh is the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard. Awash, the science fiction writer who founded Scientology in the 1950s. Now, at this point, the show does something genuinely audacious, which is that it depicts the founding theology of Scientology, the Xenu story, the story that, at that time, was technically supposed to be secret within the church, revealed only to members who had reached a certain level of advancement. The story involves a galactic ruler named Xenu who, roughly 75 million years ago, solved an overpopulation problem in the galaxy by transporting billions of people to Earth, killing them with hydrogen bombs, and then capturing their souls, which subsequently attach themselves to human bodies and continue to create spiritual trauma to this day. The episode depicts all of this in detail on screen with a chyron running along the bottom of the screen that reads, in large text, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." It was not inaccurate. While all of this is happening, Tom Cruise arrives at Stan's house. And here's where the other half of the episode begins. Cruise asks Stan what he thinks of his movies. Stan says he thinks he's okay, but not as good as Leonardo DiCaprio or Gene Hackman or the guy who played Napoleon Dynamite. He's fine, Stan says, but he's not up there with those people. Cruise is devastated by this. He walks into Stan's room, closes the door, and locks himself in the closet. The episode then becomes a sustained and extraordinarily committed pun. Tom Cruise will not come out of the closet. The entire town mobilizes to try to get him out. John Travolta, another famous Scientologist, arrives to help. He too ends up in the closet. R. Kelly arrives, are singing in the style of his then famous Trapped in the Closet narrative series. He also ends up in the closet. Nicole Kidman, Cruise's ex-wife at the time, is brought in. She can't get him out either. News anchors repeatedly report, with complete straightforwardness, that Tom Cruise won't come out of the closet. The pun is the packaging. What's inside it is a fairly direct question about Cruise's identity, about his relationship to the Church of Scientology, about the gap between the enormous cultural power he wielded as one of the most famous actors on the planet and the fragility he displayed whenever someone said something he didn't want to hear. Stan, remember, didn't say Cruise was bad. He said he was okay. That was enough. That was all it took to send one of the most famous people in the world running into a child's bedroom closet and refusing to come out. The episode is Emmy nominated, which is worth noting. The Television Academy looked at an episode in which Tom Cruise is depicted refusing to come out of a closet while the Church of Scientology's founding mythology is displayed in full detail on screen, and decided it was one of the best things on television that year. Which says something about the episode. It says it was doing something more than just causing offense. It was doing something artistically and satirically significant. The real-world consequences are almost as interesting as the episode itself. The episode reportedly upset Cruise significantly. There were reports at the time that he threatened to withdraw from promotion of Mission Impossible 3, which was being distributed by Viacom, the same company that owned Comedy Central, which aired South Park. The report suggested that Viacom pulled a planned rerun of the episode under that pressure. Parker and Stone were reportedly furious. Cruise later denied he had issued any threats, and the episode did eventually air again, but the whole sequence of events became part of the story of the episode in a way that reinforced exactly what the episode was saying. The fragility, the disproportionate response to criticism, the willingness to use power to suppress something that made you uncomfortable. Isaac Hayes, who had voiced the beloved character Chef on South Park since the very first season, departed the show around this time. Hayes was a Scientologist, and the official public reason he gave for leaving was disagreement with the show's depiction of Scientology in this episode. His son later claimed on social media that someone within Hayes' Scientology circle had effectively quit the show on his behalf without his full knowledge or consent, and that Hayes' declining health may have been a factor in the situation. However it happened, the loss of Hayes was a real one for the show, and the episode that precipitated it became even more heavily discussed as a result. Chef was subsequently written out of the show in a way that was equal parts tribute to the character and a pointed response to the circumstances of Hayes' departure. But that's a story for another time. And what matters about Trapped in the Closet in the context of tonight's conversation is what it represents in the arc of South Park's celebrity satire. It's the first time the show went after someone who had the resources and the motivation to actually push back in a real and meaningful way. And it didn't just push back in the form of a blog post or a disappointed interview. It pushed back in the form of actual corporate pressure. And the show survived it. Parker and Stone didn't back down. They didn't apologize. They didn't soften the episode when it came time to air it again. They had said what they wanted to say, and the fact that it created consequences didn't change anything about whether they believed it needed to be said. That willingness to absorb the consequences, to look directly at the blast radius of a creative decision and proceed anyway, is part of what made South Park what it was. And it's part of what made Trapped in the Closet one of the defining moments not just of the show's celebrity satire, but of the show as a whole. Cruz would return to South Park. He couldn't stay away in a sense because the show wasn't done with him. The episode had asked a question about him, and questions like that have a way of generating sequels. We'll get there. But first, there were two more women who needed to be looked at. Two very different women, two very different kinds of celebrity, two very different portraits of what fame does to people. And both of them are essential to the story we're telling tonight. In late 2004, South Park aired an episode that on the surface looks like a fairly standard celebrity roast, and underneath is something considerably more pointed. The episode was called Stupid Spoiled Whore Video Playset, and it aired in December of that year as the 12th episode of Season 8. It was about Paris Hilton, and it was about what Paris Hilton represented in the culture at that particular moment. And to understand what the episode was really doing, it helps to remember exactly where celebrity culture was in 2004. Paris Hilton had become one of the most talked about people in America almost overnight. She was the heiress to the Hilton hotel fortune. She was extraordinarily wealthy, and she had cultivated a public persona that was, to put it generously, deliberately vapid. She was famous for being famous. She went to parties. She said things in interviews that made her seem either very stupid or very strategic in a way that was difficult to distinguish from very stupid. She had a sex tape that had been released without her consent in 2003, which caused enormous public scandal, and then she had somehow navigated that scandal not by disappearing, but by becoming even more famous. She launched fragrances and television shows and a reality program about her life. She was everywhere, and the culture was in a genuine state of ambivalence about what to do with her. Part of the culture was fascinated, part of it was contemptuous, and a significant part of it, particularly the part that included young girls and teenagers, was actively trying to emulate her. Her persona, which she had constructed with more deliberateness than she was usually given credit for, was enormously influential in a way that made a lot of people uncomfortable. Being rich, being beautiful, being unabashedly focused on your own image and enjoyment, these things were being presented not just as acceptable, but as aspirational, as goals, as a model of how to live. South Park's episode addresses this head-on, but it addresses it through the girls of South Park rather than through Paris Hilton herself. Hilton arrives in town to open a new store called Stupid Spoiled Whore, and the girls of South Park immediately begin to imitate her. Wendy Testaberger, who functions as the episode's moral center, is horrified by what she's watching her friends do. She argues against it. She pushes back. And the episode watches her struggle to make the case that there's something wrong with what's happening, while the rest of the girls around her are completely swept up in the Hilton persona. Hilton herself is depicted in the episode with a particular detail that became one of the things most discussed about it. Her pet dogs keep dying. Throughout the episode, each of her small dogs finds a way to kill itself. They shoot themselves. They find ways to end their own lives while she's distracted by her phone or her social engagements. The joke is dark enough that it might seem gratuitous if you take it at face value, But what it's actually doing is quite specific. It's saying that proximity to this particular kind of fame is lethal. That the world Paris Hilton inhabits, the one she's inviting these young girls to aspire to, is a world so devoid of genuine connection or meaning that even the creatures closest to her can't survive it. The episode's conclusion involves Hilton being defeated not by a moral argument but by Mr. Slave, a recurring character in the show, in a way that is deliberately outrageous and impossible to describe in polite company. But even in that conclusion, there's a point. The way Hilton is dispatched is through a display of something completely authentic and completely without pretension, something that has absolutely no interest in being aspirational or glamorous. The message is something like, genuine shamelessness, the real kind, is more powerful than the perform kind. The real thing wins, the brand loses. It's not one of the show's most subtle episodes, but it lands because it's saying something real about a dynamic that was actually unfolding in the culture. About what happens when fame becomes a product that gets marketed directly to young people. About the difference between a person and a persona. And about the responsibility that comes with that kind of influence, whether or not the person wielding it thinks they have any. Hilton has spoken about the episode in various ways over the years, and her responses have generally been fairly gracious, which is, interestingly, the kind of response that makes the satire sting a little less. When the target laughs along with you, it becomes harder to maintain the sharpness of the criticism. South Park would deal with this problem in various ways over the years, and we'll see the results of that as we go. But the episode about Paris Hilton, and for all its excess, was in some ways a relatively gentle version of what the show was capable of when it turned its attention to the question of what fame does to the people who consume it, as much as the people who produce it. Because the harder, darker version of that question came 4 years later. And it's one of the most unsettling episodes South Park ever made, Britney's New Look, Season 12, Episode 2. It aired on March 19th, 2008. By March of 2008, what had happened to Britney Spears in public was one of the more distressing things the celebrity media cycle had produced in years. She had been one of the most famous entertainers on the planet since the late 1990s, one of the defining pop stars of her generation. And between 2006 and 2008, she had gone through a public breakdown that was covered by the media, by paparazzi, and by entertainment shows and tabloids and blogs, with a combination of prurient fascination and barely concealed glee that, even at the time, made a lot of people uncomfortable if they thought about it too hard. The head-shaving incident in February 2007, the custody battles, the hospitalizations, the conservatorship, all of it was photographed, published, debated, and consumed by an audience of millions, and the machinery that produced and distributed that content was printing money the entire time. The worse things got for Britney Spears as a human being, the better the numbers were for every outlet that was covering her. And South Park looked at that and made an episode that is, in some ways, an indictment not of Britney Spears, but of everyone watching. The episode begins with Stan and Kyle trying to find Britney Spears in order to photograph her. They're behaving like paparazzi. They find her hiding in a cabin, disguised, trying to escape the cameras, and they trick their way in to get pictures of her. They get their photos. And then they feel bad about it. They decide they've made a mistake. They try to help her escape from the attention, to get her somewhere safe, somewhere the cameras can't find her, and they can't. Because wherever they take her, the cameras and the crowd and the attention follow. There's a sequence in the episode where she gives a disastrous performance at a music awards show. She's not dressed in a way that flatters her. Her performance is poor, and the audience and the media respond with absolute savage delight in cataloging everything wrong about her appearance, picking apart every detail of how she looks and moves and presents herself. It's a scene that doesn't feel like satire in the moment it's depicting. It feels like documentation. Because it was essentially what had actually happened at the real MTV Video Music Awards in September 2007, when Spears opened the show with a performance that was roundly criticized and which became the subject of immediate and extensive mockery. The episode's twist, the thing that makes it genuinely dark, comes in the final act. Stan and Kyle think they can save her. They think if they can just get her away from the cameras, away from the noise, she'll be okay. But they're wrong. Because the crowd that's following her isn't just a crowd of paparazzi doing a job or tabloid readers satisfying a curiosity. The episode reveals that the town of South Park, that Randy and Sharon Marsh and all the other adults are all part of it. All of them. And they're not doing it because they're malicious or because they hate her. They're doing it because they need it. Because there's something in the collective desire to watch a famous woman fall apart that serves a function the episode eventually names directly as a kind of ritual sacrifice. A harvest ritual. The crowd needs Britney Spears to be destroyed so that things can grow. She is not a person to them. She is an offering. Stan and Kyle watch her die on the floor, surrounded by cameras. And then the episode ends with the crowd turning to look at a television screen where someone is mentioning Miley Cyrus, Hannah Montana, the next star, or the next young woman who will be built up and then torn down according to the same cycle. Randy Marsh looks at the screen and says approvingly that the next harvest will be even better. And then the whole town begins to sing. It's one of the few South Park endings that doesn't offer any relief. There's no correction. No one learns anything. The cycle continues. Stan and Kyle have given up. They've stopped trying to fix it. They just roll their eyes and eventually join in because there's nothing else to do. That's how inevitable the episode makes it feel. How structural. Not the cruelty of a few people, but the cruelty of the system itself, which keeps running whether or not any individual participant chooses to engage. The episode aired on March 19, 2008, just weeks after Spears' legal conservatorship had been established that same February. The conservatorship would not become a major cultural flashpoint until its dissolution 13 years later in November 2021. Watching Britney's new look today, knowing everything that has since come out, is a different experience than watching it was when it aired. It's more accurate now somehow, more uncomfortable. The things it was saying in cartoon form about the machinery of celebrity destruction turned out to be a fairly precise description of what was actually happening. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. A cartoon that aired in 2008 was, in several important ways, a more honest account of what was being done to Britney Spears than most of the actual journalism that was covering her at the time. Parker and Stone didn't have access to any information that wasn't publicly available. They just looked at what was happening and followed the logic of it. And the logic of it, when followed all the way to its conclusion, looked like a ritual sacrifice for a good harvest. There's a real contrast between the Paris Hilton episode and the Britney Spears episode that's worth naming, because it tells you something about how the show's thinking about celebrity evolved between 2004 and 2008. The Paris Hilton episode is about a person who has cultivated and weaponized her own fame, who is using the system deliberately and profitably and in ways the episode finds troubling. The satire is pointed at Hilton as an active participant. The Britney Spears episode is about a person who has been consumed by the system, who is not using it but being used by it, who has lost control of her own story entirely, if she ever had it. The satire in that episode is not pointed at Spears at all, it's pointed at the audience. At everyone who clicked the link, bought the magazine, watched the awards show performance, and then watched the reaction to the awards show performance. At the whole chain of consumption that made the whole thing happen. You, watching, are the townspeople of South Park singing a harvest song. That's the episode's thesis. And it delivered it in 2008 and then waited for the rest of the culture to catch up. These two episodes together form something important in South Park's canon. They're not just celebrity satire in the conventional sense. They're using celebrity as a way to examine the relationship between fame and audience, between the person on the screen and the people watching them. And they're asking quietly and then not so quietly about what we want from our famous people. what we need from them, and what we're willing to do to get it. And that question, the one about what fame does to its subjects, but also about what fame reveals about the people who consume it, was going to reach its most famous and most precisely targeted expression 1 year later, in April of 2009, in an episode about a joke, an ego, and a man who couldn't hear what a simple punchline was actually saying about him. This next one is the one most people think of first when they think about South Park and celebrity ego, and it deserves every bit of that reputation. Season 13, Episode 5. Fishsticks. It aired on April 8th, 2009, and it was written and directed by Trey Parker. And I want to take this one slowly because it deserves that. Because of all the celebrity ego episodes in South Park's history, this is the one that works on the most levels simultaneously, the one that is most purely and elegantly constructed, and the one that has had the longest and most interesting real-world afterlife. There's a reason it's still the episode that comes up first when people talk about South Park and celebrity. It earned that. Let me tell you the whole thing from the beginning. The episode starts with Cartman showing up at his classmate Jimmy Valmer's house. Jimmy is a kid who uses crutches and who has a stutter, and he's one of South Park's more quietly interesting recurring characters. He's funny. He works hard at being funny. Comedy is the thing he cares about, the thing he's dedicated to. Well, Cartman arrives under the pretense of wanting to hang out, which is rarely true when Cartman does it. He asks if there's any food. Jimmy says there are fish sticks in the freezer, and while Jimmy is getting them, a joke occurs to him. The joke is this. Do you like fish sticks? Yeah. Do you like to put fish sticks in your mouth? Yeah. What are you, a gay fish? And Jimmy finds it funny. It's a wordplay joke, a pun on fish sticks and a piece of anatomical slang. It's not sophisticated, but it works. And Jimmy is excited about it the way a comedian is excited about a joke that actually lands. He tells Cartman, and Cartman laughs, and then they go to school and tell it to their friends, and their friends laugh. And then they tell more people, and those people laugh, and within a couple of days, it's on television. Jay Leno is telling the fish sticks joke on The Tonight Show. It's gone everywhere. The whole country thinks it's hilarious, except for one person, Kanye West. Kanye West in the episode is a rapper at the height of his fame and his public self-regard. He's surrounded by handlers, and yes, people, he's performing, he's being celebrated everywhere he goes. And then people start telling him the fish sticks joke. And unlike everyone else in the country, he does not find it funny. And unlike most people who don't find a joke funny, he can't simply move on, because the joke seems to be about him. People keep asking him if he likes fish sticks, and when he says yes, they start calling him a gay fish. And Kanye in the episode cannot understand why. He takes the question at face value. He consults doctors to confirm that he does not have gills, that he is definitively not a fish. He sits with his crew and tries to work through the logic of the joke and genuinely cannot find the path from the setup to the punchline. He's not pretending not to understand. He genuinely doesn't get it, and his inability to get it makes him increasingly upset and increasingly dangerous, because the only explanation he can think of for why people are telling him this joke is that they're spreading malicious rumors about him. Carlos Mencia, the comedian, appears in the episode to claim credit for the joke. This is a reference to Mencia's real-world reputation for joke theft, for taking material from other comedians and performing it as his own, which had been publicly documented and debated in the comedy world for years. In the episode, Fishsticks, Mencia goes on Conan O'Brien's show and takes credit for the fish sticks joke. Kanye sees this and is furious, not because Mencia is taking credit for something he didn't create, but because Kanye thinks Mencia is the one who has been spreading rumors about him being a gay fish. He goes to Mencia's house and kills him. It's played for absurd comedy, but there's a point inside the absurdity about what happens when someone powerful enough to act on their misapprehensions does so, and the collateral damage that results. Meanwhile, back at South Park Elementary, the question of who actually invented the joke is causing its own problems. It was Jimmy's joke, clearly. Jimmy came up with it. But Cartman has, through a series of increasingly elaborate false memories, convinced himself that he invented it. The false memories are one of the episode's funniest sequences. In Cartman's version of events, he didn't just come up with the joke. He came up with it while performing heroic acts. He saved Jimmy from a black widow spider. He slew a dragon. He fought off robot enemies. Each time his memory revises the story, he gives himself more credit and more heroism. The joke becomes less and less Jimmy's and more his, until in his memory he is solely responsible for the greatest joke ever told. Kyle watches all of this happening and is the one who names what's going on. He tells Cartman that he believes him. He says he genuinely believes that Cartman believes he created the joke. But what he also believes, Kyle says, is that Cartman's ego is so damaged and so fragile that it will do anything to protect itself. That it will perform mental gymnastics of Olympic complexity to make Cartman feel like he's great when the reality is that he's just a douchebag. Kyle is talking about Cartman, but he's also obviously talking about Kanye. The two storylines are mirrors of each other. Cartman's ego rewrites history. Kanye's ego can't read a simple joke, different expressions of the same problem. The episode climaxes with Cartman and Jimmy appearing on the Ellen DeGeneres show to discuss the joke. Cartman talks over Jimmy, who stutters and takes the credit. Jimmy asks Cartman how he can live with himself. And then Kanye arrives with his entourage and ties them up, planning to kill them, to make them explain why they called him a gay fish. And here is where the episode does its most elegant thing. Because Cartman, in that moment, he genuinely seems to understand what Kyle was telling him. He seems to get it. There's a flicker of comprehension on his face, and then his ego gets it completely backwards. He turns to Jimmy and tells Jimmy that Jimmy is the one who falsely believes he created the joke. That Jimmy's ego is so bloated he goes to incredible lengths to claim credit for things that aren't his. He says all the things Kyle said to him about himself, but aimed at Jimmy instead. He has heard the diagnosis perfectly and immediately applied it to the wrong person. Jimmy, bewildered and outmaneuvered by someone who has just used self-awareness as a weapon against him, gives up and tells Kanye that yes, Cartman invented the joke. Cartman gets full credit. And in this moment, Kanye has a revelation. He realizes, or thinks he realizes, is that people were trying to help him all along, that they were telling him he was a gay fish, not to mock him, but to guide him towards some kind of truth. He walks out to the dock, he looks at the ocean, and he jumps in. The episode ends with a song called Gay Fish, which is a parody of Kanye's own song, Heartless. It's auto-tuned, it's produced in Kanye's style, and it depicts him living beneath the ocean, finally at peace, finally among others who understand him, finally not having to pretend to be something he's not. It's funny and also somehow genuinely a little beautiful. The song is well made. It takes the parody seriously enough to actually execute it. And Kanye at the end seems happy, which is the cruelest possible ending for a satire about ego. Not destruction, just relief. The response to the episode was immediate and large. It was the most watched South Park episode on the show's official streaming site as of June 2009. It had over 1.2 million more household viewers than the second most watched Comedy Central show the same week it aired. It was everywhere, and it generated enormous amounts of discussion, and most of that discussion came back to the question of whether it was fair, whether the episode had gotten something right. Kanye West's response came within 24 hours of the episode airing. He wrote about it on his blog, which he maintained at the time as a place to share his thoughts and his work and his perspective on the world. And what he wrote was interesting. He said, in the kind of capitalized blog prose that was characteristic of his writing at the time, that South Park had murdered him the night before, and that it was pretty damn funny. And he said it hurt his feelings, but that you couldn't expect anything different from South Park. He said he had actually been working on his ego, that having a crazy ego was played out at that point in his life and career, that he used to use it to build himself up when nobody believed in him, and that now that people did believe and support his music, the best response was thank you instead of I told you so. He thanked the writers at South Park. He wished them well. It was, by any measure, a gracious and self-aware response. And then, 5 months later, Kanye West walked onto the stage at the MTV Video Music Awards during Taylor Swift's acceptance speech, took the microphone out of her hand, and told the audience that her fellow nominee Beyoncé had had one of the best videos of all time. The incident was enormous. It was discussed everywhere. It was almost universally condemned. It felt, to many people watching, like exactly the thing the Fishsticks episode had been describing. An ego so large and so poorly calibrated that it genuinely couldn't perceive the basic social boundaries that everyone else in the room was operating within. An ego that didn't understand the joke because, on some level, it couldn't take the perspective required to see itself from the outside. Comedy Central rebroadcast Fishsticks for 2 straight hours on September 15th, 2009, 2 days after the VMA incident. They didn't need to say anything. The broadcast was the statement. The episode's afterlife with Kanye is one of the most fascinating ongoing stories in South Park celebrity history. He referenced it in his 2010 song Gorgeous, where he rapped about wanting to choke a South Park writer with a fish stick. It appeared again in a leaked version of another track. The wound stayed open. He couldn't let it go the way Carlos Mencia had more or less let it go. Because Mencia's cameo in the episode was a side joke, Kanye was the central one. The episode had said something about him specifically, about the particular quality of his ego and his relationship to criticism, and his inability to understand simple jokes at his own expense. And he kept proving it right. There's a detail from the DVD commentary on Fishsticks that's worth knowing, because it says something about how the episode was conceived. Parker and Stone have said that the idea started at a writer's retreat in Seattle, where they saw a salmon jumping, and someone made a joke about a salmon dressed as Evel Knievel. And that image, a salmon in a jumpsuit leaping dramatically over something, reminded them of Kanye West's music video for his song Touch the Sky, in which Kanye appears dressed in an Evel Knievel costume jumping the Grand Canyon. That visual connection between a fish doing something grandiose and Kanye doing something grandiose was the seed of the whole episode. The Fishsticks joke came later. The gay fish ending came from following that first image to its conclusion. It's a reminder that the best satire often starts with something very specific and very concrete. Not an abstract analysis of a person's psychology, but a specific image, a specific moment, something you actually noticed about them that made you think, wait, yes, that, and then you follow it. The episode also works as a satire of the comedy world more generally, through the Carlos Mencia thread. Mencia's real reputation was as someone who took jokes from other comedians without credit, and the episode dramatizes that as an almost reflexive act of institutional appropriation. The way joke theft works in comedy, the way credit gets taken, the way someone small and clever can be displaced by someone loud and famous, is all present in the Jimmy and Cartman storyline. And in a nice structural recursion, the episode uses Jimmy, a character who is disabled and who struggles with speech, as the true creative genius whose work gets stolen by someone who has fewer barriers to making himself heard. There's something in there about who gets to be seen as the author of ideas and why. What Fishsticks ultimately does, the reason it endures, is that it manages to be about celebrity ego specifically through Kanye, and about creative ego specifically through Cartman, and about the nature of self-awareness and its limits, and about the relationship between comedy and power, all at the same time. It's a 22-minute animated episode that accomplishes more than most longer-form satire manages. And the fact that it had a real-world second act, that Kanye West proved its central argument correct 5 months after it aired, and then continued to prove it correct in the years that followed, makes it something close to a masterpiece of its specific form. There's a version of Fishsticks where it's just a funny episode about a celebrity who doesn't get a joke. That version exists and it's enjoyable on its own. But the version we actually got is something more than that. It's an episode that looked at a specific famous person with a specific kind of ego and said something true about him, and then waited and was right. And it was right not in a mean way, or at least not only in a mean way. The episode's final image, Kanye underwater, finally happy, swimming with fish, who accept him, singing a song in his own voice about finally being free from the pressure of being what everyone expects him to be, is genuinely a little moving if you let it be. The satire is sharp. But underneath it, there's something almost sympathetic. An acknowledgement that the ego on display might not be entirely Kanye's fault. That there's something about the system that produces a person like that. The relentless expectation, the constant performance of confidence, as the cultural demand that a black artist from Chicago be simultaneously humble and superhuman, that creates the very quality the show is lampooning. South Park doesn't usually linger in that kind of nuance. It tends to hit and move on. But Fishsticks, in its last few minutes, does something tender with its target. It gives him somewhere to go, not in defeat, but in release. That's an unusual thing for South Park to do. And it's part of why this particular episode sits at the very top of what the show has done with celebrity ego. Not just the precision of the satire, not just the timing, not just the absurdist genius of the Fishsticks punchline, but the humanity in the ending. The small grace of letting the ego finally stop fighting and swim. And by the time that episode had finished airing and Kanye had written his blog post and the culture had moved on to the next thing, South Park had already been building towards something else. Something bigger, something that would take every celebrity it had ever mocked and put them all in the same room. The show was almost at its 200th episode, and Parker and Stone had an idea. Season 14, episodes 5 and 6, 200 and 201. They aired on April 14th and April 21st of 2010, and together they represent something that South Park had never quite attempted before, and has never quite attempted since. A genuine reckoning with its own history, an accounting of everything the show had done to the famous people it had mocked, and a definitive statement about what all of that had meant. Let me tell you how it starts. Tom Cruise is in South Park. He's working at a fudge factory, which is already a joke, but he's just trying to go about his business. And then Stan Marsh appears and calls him a fudge packer. Stan means it literally because Cruise is packing fudge at the fudge factory. Cruise is devastated anyway. He can't help it. The words land wrong, they always do. And he decides that he's had enough. He's tired of being mocked by this town. He's tired of being the butt of jokes he doesn't deserve. And he decides to do something about it. He's going to sue South Park. He's going to bring a class action lawsuit against the town on behalf of every celebrity that South Park has ever mocked. And then the episode begins assembling its cast. Because what follows is essentially a tribute to the show's entire history of celebrity satire, rendered as a legal proceeding. One by one, the famous people South Park has depicted over the years arrive in town. They have grievances, they have lawyers, and they have a plan. They're going to sue for damages, they're going to get what's owed to them, and they're going to use the settlement money for a purpose that quickly becomes the episode's central plot thread. The celebrity they want, the one they're going to spend the lawsuit trying to obtain, is Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. Not because they have any particular interest in Islam or in Muhammad personally, but because Muhammad possesses the one quality every celebrity wants and none of them has: the ability to not be made fun of, the immunity from mockery. Muhammad cannot be depicted satirically, not because of any law, but because of the very real threat of violence from extremist groups that would follow any such depiction. And so Muhammad, in the logic of this episode, has a superpower that Tom Cruise and Barbra Streisand and all the others desperately want for themselves. He's the only celebrity in the world who is genuinely safe from ridicule. The episode is built around this idea with characteristic South Park ingenuity. The celebrities don't actually want what Muhammad represents spiritually or philosophically or religiously. They want his immunity. They want a shield. The most famous people in the world, standing together in a coalition of grievance and wounded pride, are reaching for protection. For the one thing fame can't actually buy, which is the right to exist without being mocked. Mecha-Streisand is rebuilt and deployed. She tears through South Park again, returning from her original appearance in Season 1, slightly updated but fundamentally the same. Barbra Streisand monster. The running joke of the show's entire history with celebrity, alive again and rampaging. The episode is deeply aware of itself as a historical document. It knows what it's doing. It's presenting a bill of particulars for its own history and then examining what that history means. The 200th episode was the most watched South Park episode in years when it aired. The premiere of a two-part story that the show had been building toward, in some sense, since episode 12 of season 1. Since Mecha-Streisand first stomped through the town, and Robert Smith of The Cure saved everyone. Since Barbra Streisand first represented the idea that ego, unchecked, becomes a monster. And Kanye is there, still wearing his gay fish outfit from Fishsticks. He's been in the sea swimming with the fish, and he has come up to join the lawsuit. Because even living happily as a gay fish apparently isn't enough to fully insulate him from the injustice of having been made fun of. The detail is perfect. It's funny on the surface, and underneath it's pointing at something real about how fame works on people. Even when they've found peace, even when they've moved on, the wound stays open. The mockery stays alive. You can be underwater with the fish and still feel it. The second episode, 201, is where things get genuinely complicated, because Comedy Central intervened. The episode contains depictions that the network felt could provoke real-world violence. And before it aired, the network applied a level of censorship to it that Parker and Stone publicly disagreed with and were vocal about objecting to. Speeches were bleeped, certain content was blocked. The episode aired in a form that its creators did not endorse, and that they subsequently made clear did not represent what they had intended. The episode remains, as of this writing, one of the more difficult to access in the South Park catalog. It's not available on some streaming platforms. The version that exists publicly is the censored one. Parker and Stone have said they were disappointed by the network's decision, that they felt it contradicted the show's core commitment to saying the things that needed to be said without flinching. The irony was not lost on anyone. An episode about celebrities wanting immunity from mockery was itself subjected to a form of imposed immunity. The show, for once, couldn't say the thing it wanted to say. But even in its censored form, the 200th and 201st episodes accomplish something remarkable. They take the entire history of the show's celebrity satire and treat it as a coherent body of work, as something that has been building toward a conclusion. And the conclusion they reach is this: the thing every celebrity in the episode wants, immunity from ridicule, is exactly the thing that a free and functioning culture cannot grant anyone. Not Muhammad, not Tom Cruise, not Barbra Streisand, not anyone. The argument South Park had been making across more than a decade of celebrity episodes is finally stated outright. The ability to say things about famous people, to hold them up to examination, to follow their egos to their logical conclusion and present the results, is not a luxury of a free society, it's a necessity of one. Remove it, and you remove the capacity to say true things about power, and the people with the most power, the people who can most afford to be examined and most need to be examined, are exactly the people who have the resources and the motivation to suppress that examination if they're allowed to. The celebrities in the episode are not villains exactly, they're just people who have been hurt, people who have been mocked and caricatured and who don't like it. Their pain is real. Tom Cruise probably doesn't enjoy being depicted as a person who locks himself in closets when confronted with mild criticism. Barbra Streisand probably didn't enjoy being depicted as a kaiju. Their grievances taken in isolation have a certain legitimacy. But taken together as a coalition assembled to prevent a culture from saying true things about power, they become something else. They become a threat. Not because any individual one of them is dangerous, but because the logic of their desire, if satisfied, would hollow out something essential. That's the argument. And it's worth noting that South Park, a show that has been criticized from all directions at various points in its history for being too cruel, too offensive, too conservative, too liberal, too focused on shock value, was making this argument about itself as much as anything else. The celebrities in the lawsuit have legitimate grievances against the town of South Park, which is to say, against the show. The show is acknowledging that its satire has real costs for real people. And then it's arguing that those costs are worth paying, that the alternative is worse, that the ability to say difficult things about famous people is connected in important ways to the ability to say difficult things about everyone else too. It's a grown-up argument. More grown-up, honestly, than a lot of what surrounded it in the culture at the time. And it came wrapped in animation and outrageous comedy and Mecha-Streisand, which is the kind of delivery mechanism that South Park had always used and always would. There's a detail in the 200th episode that's worth pausing on because it says something about the scope of what Parker and Stone had built without perhaps fully intending to. The class action lawsuit is enormous, dozens of celebrities, with hundreds of episodes of history represented in that room. And the episode treats all of them with the same basic dignity, which is the dignity of being taken seriously enough to be satirized. Every celebrity in that room is there because someone at South Park looked at them closely enough to find the specific thing worth making a joke about. The specific truth worth following to its extreme. That's not nothing, it's a strange form of respect. The show has never mocked anyone it didn't look at carefully first. It has never aimed for general vagueness or cultural shorthand. It has always been specific. Specific about what the target represents, specific about what makes them interesting as a satirical subject, specific about the human reality beneath the celebrity persona. Even at its most outrageous, the celebrity satire in South Park has always been grounded in something real that the writers noticed and decided to name. The 200th and 201st episodes are the moment when the show turned around and looked at all of that work and asked itself what it had been doing. And the answer it gave, through the legal metaphor of a class action lawsuit, through the premise of celebrities demanding immunity from the thing that had defined the show's history, was that it had been doing something necessary, something that a healthy culture needs, something that discomfort and lawsuits and angry blog posts and departed cast members and network censorship cannot and should not be allowed to stop. It was a statement. Quiet in its way, delivered through comedy, wrapped in the familiar language of the show. But a statement nonetheless. And after that 2-part episode aired, after the lawsuits and the celebrity coalition and Mecha-Streisand and Kanye in his fish outfit and all of it, South Park did what it always did. It moved on. It found new things to say, new targets, new questions, new ways to use the machinery it had built over 13 years to make the specific and the true feel funny. But Kanye West wasn't done yet. South Park had one more thing to say about him. And this time, the target wasn't just his ego in relation to criticism. This time, the target was his ego in relation to the person he loved. Because by 2013, Kanye was engaged to Kim Kardashian. And South Park had some thoughts about that too. Season 17, Episode 10, The Hobbit. It aired on December 11th, 2013, and it was the season finale that year. And it's interesting because it's technically a return appearance for Kanye West, his second full episode as a subject, and yet the episode is not really about Kanye at all. Or rather, Kanye is present and performing a version of what he always performs in South Park, which is a man desperately trying to defend something against criticism he finds incomprehensible. But the actual subject of The Hobbit is something broader and more contemporary, something that spoke to where the culture was in 2013 in a way that made the episode feel not like a sequel to Fishsticks, but like its own thing. The episode begins at South Park Elementary. A boy named Butters has developed a crush on Lisa Berger, a girl in his class. He tells his friends that he thinks she's beautiful, and the other kids tell him he's wrong. Not because she isn't a perfectly nice person, but because she doesn't look like the girls in magazines or on television or in the altered photographs that had, by 2013, saturated every digital surface. She doesn't look like a photoshopped version of herself, she looks like herself. And in the logic of the culture the episode is examining, that disqualified her from the category of beautiful. Wendy Testaberger, who as we've established is often the show's moral compass in episodes dealing with social hypocrisy, makes the observation that the images the kids are using as their standard of beauty are not real. That the women in those images don't look like that. That they've been digitally altered to remove flaws and adjust proportions and smooth imperfections until what remains is not a photograph of a person, but a rendering. A fiction. Wendy makes the argument clearly and directly, and she's right, and nobody wants to hear it. Into this situation walks Kanye West. He's no longer dressed as a gay fish. He's back to being Kanye, or the show's version of Kanye, which is a man perpetually primed for confrontation and perpetually unable to understand why the confrontation keeps happening. He's engaged to Kim Kardashian. And the girls at South Park Elementary have been saying that Kim Kardashian looks like a hobbit. They mean it as an insult because hobbit is an insult in this context, a shorthand for short and stocky and not conventionally beautiful. Kanye is furious about this. He will not accept it. Kim is beautiful. She is not a hobbit. He is absolutely certain of this, and he will fight anyone who suggests otherwise. He calls Kim to clarify details about whether she's a hobbit. He lists the qualities that distinguish her from a hobbit. He sings a song called My Bee. Ain't no hobbit. He argues with Wendy about whether the beauty standards being applied to Kim are fair or reasonable or grounded in reality. And throughout all of this, the episode keeps making the point, quietly but persistently, that the girls of South Park are using images of Kim Kardashian that have been so heavily processed, so extensively altered, that the original person is barely present in them. The image of Kim Kardashian they're comparing real girls to is not a representation of a real person, it's a construction, a project, and Kanye defending the honor and the beauty of his fiancée is defending an image, not the person, the image. And the ego that drives that defense is not actually about Kim at all. It's about Kanye's need to possess something perfect, his need for everything around him to be the best, his inability to tolerate the suggestion that something he loves might be imperfect, not because he loves it, but because imperfection in the things he's associated with reflects on him. The episode is making a specific argument about the relationship between Kanye's ego and Photoshop culture, about how the demand for impossible beauty standards and the demand for uncritical admiration of the things you've chosen are related. About how the person who says my partner is not just beautiful, but the most beautiful, the standard by which all beauty should be judged, is using their partner as an extension of their own image rather than as a person in their own right. So Wendy tries to make the case for honest beauty, for the dignity of looking like yourself rather than a digitally corrected fantasy version of yourself. She makes it to Kanye and she makes it to the girls in her class, and nobody listens. By the end of the episode, Wendy has lost. The culture of Photoshop perfection has won. The girls are editing their own photos. The standards remain. And Kanye is still calling Kim to confirm she's not a hobbit. It's one of those South Park episodes that ends in defeat, or at least in stalemate, and does so on purpose. Because the thing it's describing is not a problem with an easy solution. You can't win this argument by making the argument clearly. The culture has already decided. and the ego that's invested in the lie is too large to be dislodged by the truth. What's interesting about The Hobbit as a Kanye episode is that it's significantly gentler than Fishsticks. There's no violence, there's no murder, there's no ego-driven breakdown that ends with someone jumping into the sea. Kanye is absurd here and somewhat sad, but he's not dangerous in the way he was in Fishsticks, he's just wrong. And being wrong in the specific way he's wrong in this episode, defending an image against reality, defending a standard against honesty, is something the episode clearly sees as human rather than monstrous. It's a flaw, a recognizable one that a lot of people share in a lot of different ways. That's Kanye's South Park arc in full then. 2 episodes, one about ego and self-delusion and the inability to hear criticism, one about ego and beauty standards, and the inability to tolerate imperfection in the things you've claimed as your own. Together, they form a fairly complete portrait of a particular kind of famous person. Someone whose talent is real, whose cultural impact is undeniable, and whose relationship to himself and to the world around him is complicated in ways that keep generating material. But Kanye wasn't the only target. South Park had been reaching across the full spectrum of celebrity throughout its run, and some of the episodes that don't get as much discussion are worth spending time on because they fill out the picture of what the show was actually doing and why. Take the Jennifer Lopez episodes. South Park did 2 of them in season 7, and the premise is one of those South Park ideas that sounds completely insane and then turns out to be making a very specific point. Cartman creates a hand puppet named Jennifer Lopez. The puppet becomes enormously popular. It gets signed to a record deal. It becomes a bigger star than the real Jennifer Lopez. And the real Jennifer Lopez, whose career was at its peak in 2003 when the episode aired, finds herself displaced by a puppet version of her own persona. The joke is that the hand puppet is a cruder, more exaggerated version of what the real Jennifer Lopez represents to the entertainment industry. Talent is not really the point. Image is the point. The specific cultural product she represents, which in 2003 was something like aspirational Latina glamour packaged for mainstream pop consumption, it can be replicated by anyone willing to perform it loudly enough, including Cartman's hand. There's also a recurring thread involving what Cartman does with the puppet that involves the real Jennifer Lopez's then partner Ben Affleck, which the show uses to make points about celebrity relationships and the way famous couples exist as cultural products rather than private people. The episode is crude in its execution, as South Park often is, but the underlying observation that celebrity personas are performances separable from the people performing them is one that the show would continue to develop in various ways for years. Sally Struthers, the actress best known for playing Gloria on All in the Family, had a particularly extended run as a South Park celebrity target. She first appeared in season 1 in the episode Starvin' Marvin, and which depicted her as hoarding food aid money meant for starving children overseas. The joke was based on the real Sally Struthers' real appearances in charity advertisements, where she appeared in developing countries asking viewers to donate money to help feed starving children, and on the fact that she had gained a significant amount of weight in the years between her most famous work and those advertisements. The episode depicted her keeping the food for herself, growing to enormous size, becoming a parody of the very excess she was appearing on television to condemn. It was mean in a pretty direct way, and Parker and Stone have said that they heard Struthers was genuinely upset by her depiction. And then, in typical South Park fashion, they brought her back in a subsequent episode as a Jabba the Hutt parody, which was arguably meaner than the original. The show's philosophy on this kind of thing has always been consistent. If the first time hurt, the second time will too, and that's part of the point. Not to be needlessly cruel, but to be consistent, to show that there was a principle operating, not just a random attack. The principle in the Struthers episodes was about the particular hypocrisy of visible charity. the performative nature of appearing on television to weep over suffering while the show was suggesting benefiting from the attention that suffering generates. It's a more uncomfortable thesis than just making fun of someone's weight, and it's the thesis that survived both episodes and made them something more than simple mockery. And then there's the episode about Michael Jackson, which aired in season 8 and which is called The Jeffersons. By 2004, when the episode aired, Michael Jackson was one of the most complicated celebrities in the world. He had been the biggest pop star on the planet for decades. He was also facing the most serious allegations of his life. And he was also, by that point, presenting a version of himself to the world that had become so heavily mediated, so constantly filtered through layers of performance and image management and apparent self-transformation, that the relationship between the public persona and the actual person had become almost impossible to trace. The episode depicts him moving to South Park under the alias Mr. Jefferson, wearing a fake mustache, trying to escape all of that. He has a son named Blanket who he's brought along, and the episode watches Michael, through the character of Mr. Jefferson, try to simply be a person, to be a father, to play with children and be present and enjoy things without the weight of fame pressing down on him. And he can't. Not because he doesn't want to, but because the thing he has become, the thing that decades of fame and transformation and scandal have made him, is too large to put down. He can wear the mustache, but he can't stop being Michael Jackson. Kyle notices that Mr. Jefferson keeps ignoring Blanket, keeps choosing to play with the neighborhood kids instead of his own son, and the episode is quiet about why this might be, but it's pointing at something sad inside the celebrity ego that the other episodes don't often reach. The idea that someone can want the experience of childhood so badly can be so frozen in some arrested development of self, and that they choose to perform childhood rather than parent a child. That the egos need to be the center of wonder and delight and uncomplicated love is so strong that it actually prevents genuine connection. It's one of the show's more melancholy celebrity portraits. It doesn't mock Michael Jackson's talent. It doesn't really get into the allegations against him, which were real and serious, and which the show handled separately in other episodes. What it does is look at the specific psychological cost of being as famous as he was, as transformed as he had allowed himself to become, and ask what that kind of fame leaves behind, what it takes away. The Mr. Jefferson mustache is sitting there on his face, clearly fake, clearly no kind of disguise at all. And the episode is saying that this is actually a perfect metaphor for the whole thing. You can see through it if you look, but no one can stop pretending. These are the episodes that fill out the space around the headline targets. Kanye and Tom Cruise get the most attention, and they deserve it. But the full picture of South Park's celebrity satire is richer than any 2 or 3 episodes can represent. It spans the entire run of the show. It comes from a consistent set of questions. And it keeps arriving at versions of the same answers, which is that fame is a distorting lens, that ego is both the engine and the liability, and that the gap between who famous people think they are and who they actually are is where the most interesting and the most necessary stories live. All of which brings us, as we start to ease toward the end of tonight's journey, to the question of what it all means. What all of this has been pointing at. Not just as television comedy, not just as celebrity satire, but as a kind of extended argument about the relationship between fame and truth, between power and accountability, between the audience and the famous people it creates and consumes and eventually, sometimes, destroys. Because South Park's celebrity episodes are not just a catalog of takedowns, they're an ongoing conversation. And that conversation has something to say. There's a pattern to how South Park approaches celebrity that becomes very clear when you step back and look at all of these episodes together. And once you see it, you start to see it everywhere. Not just in the show, but in the culture around it, in the celebrities themselves. In the way the culture talks about famous people and then turns on them and then rehabilitates them and then turns on them again. The pattern starts with identification. Parker and Stone, writing their episodes with a speed that no other show in television history has matched at that production level, have to find the thing, the specific truth, the particular quality of ego or delusion or hypocrisy that makes a celebrity interesting as a satirical subject. This is not a casual process. You can write a joke about almost anyone if you're willing to be mean enough. That's not hard. What's hard is finding the thing that is both specific and universal at the same time. The thing that is specifically true about this person, but that also resonates because it's recognizable in some broader human way. When South Park makes Kanye West unable to understand a Fishsticks joke, it's not just saying that Kanye is stupid, it's saying something specific about the nature of extreme ego, about the way very high self-regard creates a kind of perceptual blind spot, about how a person who has been told they're a genius often enough will eventually lose the capacity to see themselves from the outside. That's specific to Kanye in the episode, and it's universally recognizable in ways that go far beyond Kanye. We've all met someone who can't take a joke about themselves. We've all met someone whose self-image is so rigid that anything that doesn't confirm it creates a defensive crisis. The joke scales. That's what makes it a great episode rather than just a mean one. When South Park makes Tom Cruise lock himself in a closet because an 11-year-old boy said his acting was okay, it's not just mocking Cruise specifically. It's mocking the specific psychological structure of someone who has achieved enormous success through the performance of confidence and who therefore cannot afford to have that confidence questioned. Cruise's fame was built in significant part on his ability to project certainty and invulnerability. His characters are almost always winning, always competent, always in control. That persona, which served him enormously well professionally, apparently created corresponding fragility around any suggestion that he might not be all of those things. Stan's mild, honest, not even unkind assessment of his acting was not malicious. It was just true. And the truth was intolerable because the whole structure depended on it being false. When South Park makes Barbra Streisand transform into a monster while searching for an artifact of absolute cultural power, it's not just saying she's egotistical, it's saying something about what the pursuit of that kind of legacy does to a person over decades. About how the hunger for permanent cultural significance, for being remembered, for mattering in ways that outlast your physical presence, is a legitimate human drive that can curdle into something destructive if it's never examined or satisfied. These are not accidents. Parker and Stone are finding the right metaphor every time. The right absurd extreme that, when you push a real quality to its logical limit, illuminates that quality rather than obscuring it. And the consistency of that approach across 28 seasons is remarkable. They've never been satisfied with a surface-level joke. There's always a second layer, always a third. You can watch these episodes as pure comedy and get plenty out of them. But if you follow the logic, there's always more. The second thing the pattern does, after identifying the specific truth, is find the right scale. South Park's celebrity satire works by taking something real and inflating it to an extreme that would be ridiculous if it weren't also somehow accurate. The kaiju version of something that's already real. Barbra Streisand is not literally a giant robot monster, but the quality she represents, the all-consuming drive for cultural dominance, scaled to its absolute maximum, would look like a giant robot monster. The logic holds. The scale is honest. Kanye doesn't literally live underwater as a gay fish, but the quality the episode identified in him, the ego so large it creates its own reality detached from the one everyone else is living in, scaled to its maximum and followed to its conclusion, leads to someone swimming in the deep with creatures who have never heard of him and never will. The peace he finds there is the peace of finally being free from the expectation that everyone will confirm your self-image, which is maybe the most restful thing imaginable if you've been carrying that weight. Tom Cruise doesn't literally hide in closets when people criticize him, but the quality the episode identified, the fragility inside the projected confidence, the inability to tolerate even mild criticism, to scale to the extreme of a full-grown adult refusing to leave a child's bedroom closet while the entire town stands outside trying to coax him out, is both absurd and somehow completely believable. You can imagine it. That's the test. If you can imagine it, even for a second, as something that could really happen, then the satire is working. The third thing the pattern does is something that the best of these episodes do and the lesser ones often don't, which is leave the audience somewhere to go. Not all the celebrity episodes have this quality, but the ones that endure do. They don't just mock and dismiss. They don't leave the subject or the audience with nothing but contempt. They follow the logic of the ego to its conclusion, and then they show you something at the bottom of it, something human, something recognizable and real. And the Gay Fish song is the most obvious example of this. The episode has spent 22 minutes making Kanye look foolish, making his ego look ridiculous, making his inability to understand the joke the sustained punchline of every other joke. And then at the end, when he jumps in the water and the song starts, the show does something unexpected. It makes the fantasy of his ego, the underwater world where he finally belongs, look peaceful. Almost beautiful. The fish don't know who he is. They don't have expectations. He's not performing for them. He's just there. That's the mercy the show occasionally extends to its targets. Not forgiveness for whatever made them a target, not redemption, not a reversal. Just a small acknowledgement of the human thing inside the monstrous ego. The thing that made the ego so large in the first place. And the wound or the hunger or the fear that got buried under all the fame and the confidence and the cannot be wrong. Those things are real, and the best South Park celebrity episodes know they're real and make space for them, even briefly, even while the satire is still in full swing. This is why South Park's celebrity satire has lasted as long as it has, and remained as culturally relevant as it has. Not just because Parker and Stone are clever, though they are. Not just because they're fast, though they are. But because they're honest in a specific and disciplined way. They're looking at real things. They're naming them accurately, and they're following them to their logical conclusions without flinching and without pretending that the person at the center of the joke isn't also a person. There's a question worth asking, Hawk, at this point in the evening, which is whether any of it has ever actually changed anything. Whether the satire, as precise and consistent and artistically significant as it's been, has had any real effect on the people it targeted, whether it changed them or changed the culture's relationship to them, or simply documented things that would have happened anyway. The Kanye answer is complicated. He wrote a gracious blog post. He acknowledged working on his ego. And then he walked onto a stage and interrupted Taylor Swift 5 months later. The satirical diagnosis was accurate. The satirical treatment, if you could call it that, did not appear to have taken effect. He continued being Kanye. He continued generating material. He continued proving the show right in ways that were both funny and exhausting. But there's another way to look at it, which is to say that the satire wasn't supposed to change Kanye. Satire rarely changes its direct target. The target is usually too invested in their existing self-image to be reached by even the most accurate parody of it. The person who actually benefits from the satire is the audience. The people who see themselves in the exaggerated portrait and recognize something true about the limits of ego. The people who laugh at Kanye not being able to understand a Fishsticks joke and then quietly think about the last time they couldn't hear a piece of criticism that was entirely accurate. That's what good satire does. It uses the specific to illuminate the general. It uses the famous person as a screen on which to project something universal. The ego on display in Fishsticks is Kanye's ego, and specifically and precisely. But it's also everyone's ego, the particular version of it that doesn't want to be told it's wrong. The particular version that would rather believe the whole world is conspiring to spread malicious rumors than accept the much simpler explanation for why people are calling you a gay fish. The Tom Cruise episode is about Tom Cruise's specific relationship to criticism. It's also about something recognizable in every person who has ever built their identity around a particular self-image and then found that self-image threatening from the outside. The closet is specific, the feeling it describes is universal. This is the key to understanding why South Park's celebrity satire occupies a unique space in popular culture. It's not just mean, it's not just clever, it's not just fast, though it is extraordinarily fast. It's honest in the particular way that comedy at its best is honest, which is to say it takes something the culture was already feeling or thinking and names it precisely enough that the naming itself becomes a kind of relief. The joke works not just because it's surprising, but because it's right. And being right in the hands of people who can make it also be funny is the thing that makes satire last. The show has now been doing this for nearly 3 decades. The targets have changed. The culture has changed. The specific anxieties and obsessions and points of pride that make celebrities interesting as satirical subjects have shifted with every year. What was true about celebrity in 1998 was different from what was true about it in 2005, which was different from what was true in 2013. The show has had to adapt to find new ways into the old questions, to ask the same fundamental things about ego and fame and what celebrity does to a person's sense of themselves in ways that stayed relevant to whatever was happening in the culture at the moment. And it succeeded at that adaptation more consistently than almost any other long-running show you could name. Part of the reason is the production model, the ability to turn around an episode in 6 days in response to something that happened this week. Part of it is the creative consistency, the fact that Parker and Stone have been at the helm of the show for its entire run and have never handed it off to someone else or lost the thread of what it was trying to do. And part of it, maybe the most important part, is that the questions the show is asking haven't changed. And the specific celebrities have changed. The specific ego failures have changed. But the fundamental question, the thing about what fame does to people and what our relationship to fame says about us, is the same question it was when Barbra Streisand first arrived in South Park looking for the Triangle of Zinthar. That's the most honest thing you can say about South Park's celebrity satire as a body of work. It's been asking the same question for 30 years in different ways with different subjects in different registers. And the question is this: what happens when a person gets so big that they stop being able to see themselves clearly? What happens to the ego when the world around it stops telling the truth? What does fame do to the capacity for self-knowledge? And the answer the show has been giving again and again, and across hundreds of episodes and dozens of celebrities, is that fame distorts. That it builds walls around the ego that make it impossible to hear certain things. That it creates a particular kind of loneliness, a loneliness of always being reflected back at yourself the way you want to be seen rather than the way you actually are. That the most famous people in the world are often, paradoxically, the least likely to be told the truth by the people around them. And South Park, in its anarchic way, in its willingness to say what other things won't, has been a place where the truth still gets told. Where the famous and the powerful get the same treatment as the anonymous and the ordinary, where no ego is safe and no status is sufficient to prevent examination, where the questions keep getting asked no matter who gets upset about them. That commitment, that stubbornness, that refusal to extend immunity to anyone is part of what has kept the show vital. And the celebrity episodes are where it's most visible, because those are the episodes where the stakes are highest, where the targets are most capable of pushing back, where the pressure to soften or withdraw or apologize is most intense, and the show has never blinked. It has absorbed every consequence and kept going. There's something to be said for that, something worth noticing. There are a handful of other celebrity episodes that deserve time tonight because they round out the picture in ways that the headline stories don't fully cover. Not every memorable celebrity appearance in South Park was a takedown in the traditional sense. Sometimes it was something else entirely. Sometimes it was the show finding a new angle on an old question. And sometimes it was the show demonstrating that the same satirical framework could be applied to very different kinds of fame, to different flavors of ego, and arrive at conclusions that were equally precise and equally true. Take the Bono episode, Season 11, Episode 9. It aired in October of 2007, and it's called More Crap. And yes, it does involve excrement in a fairly prominent way, which is very South Park, and which you can choose to take at face value or not, depending on your tolerance for that kind of thing. But underneath the scatological humor is one of the show's more specific and pointed examinations of a celebrity ego that has wrapped itself in the language of goodness. By 2007, Bono, the lead singer of U2, he'd have been one of the most visible celebrity philanthropists in the world for years. He had been involved in debt relief campaigns for developing nations. He had organized events and pressured world leaders and sat at tables with presidents and prime ministers. He had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was, by every measure available, one of the most publicly engaged celebrities in the history of entertainment. He was also, the episode suggests, someone whose engagement with global poverty had become, on some level, inseparable from his need to be the most important person in the room. The episode's conceit is that Bono holds the world record for the largest bowel movement in history, and Randy Marsh, having produced something extraordinary in his own right, is trying to break that record, which is a very South Park way to structure a commentary on celebrity philanthropy. But the thing the episode is actually doing becomes clear when Bono is revealed. The twist is that Bono himself, the person who has spent decades being celebrated for his concern for others and his desire to help, is literally the record. He is the giant piece of excrement that Randy is trying to surpass. He was born the record. He has always been the record. And the reason he does everything he does, the philanthropy, the advocacy, the ceaseless work on behalf of the world suffering, is because deep down he knows what he is. He's trying to compensate. He's trying to transcend something about himself that he can never fully escape. It's harsh. And it's also, in its absurdist way, raising a legitimate question that the culture around celebrity philanthropy was starting to ask in 2007 and has only asked more insistently since. The question of whether very visible charitable work by very famous people is actually primarily about the cause, or whether it's also substantially about the person doing it. Whether the ego investment in being seen as someone who cares about the world is so large that it becomes a thing itself rather than a vehicle for the thing. Whether celebrity goodness is goodness, or whether it's goodness as performance. You can disagree with the answer the episode gives. You can believe that Bono's work has had real effects, and that those effects matter more than the question of what motivated them. You can believe that motivation is beside the point when the outcomes are good. But you can't say the question isn't worth asking, and you can't say South Park asked it badly. It asked it in the funniest and most outrageous way imaginable, which is its preferred method. But the question was real. Then there are the episodes from more recent seasons that show the show adapting to the specific celebrity culture of the social media era. Because the way fame works changed enormously between 1997 and the show's later seasons. The old model of celebrity, where someone was famous because they had made movies or recorded albums or won championships, was joined and in some ways displaced by a new model in which someone was famous simply because they had attracted enough attention. Fame as a self-perpetuating phenomenon rather than as a byproduct of talent or achievement. South Park has addressed this new model in various ways, and some of the sharper celebrity commentary in the later seasons is about the relationship between fame and social media specifically. The Randy Marsh storylines, which expanded significantly in the later seasons as Randy became one of the show's most prominent characters, often function as a laboratory for examining how an ordinary person navigates the desire for significance and recognition in a world that offers new and easier routes to it than ever before. Randy as a character has achieved various forms of minor celebrity over the course of the show. And each time the show examines not just the celebrity itself, but the need that drove him toward it. There's also the episode about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's visit to South Park, which arrived in season 26. The premise is based on their real-world decision to step back from formal royal duties and move to North America, which they describe publicly as being motivated significantly by concerns about privacy and media intrusion. The episode depicts them embarking on what it calls a worldwide privacy tour, where they travel the world demanding privacy while generating enormous amounts of media attention in the process. The satire there is specific and sharp and quite funny, and it's making a point that a number of commentators have been making in more earnest ways for a while, which is about the specific contradiction inherent in very publicly demanding privacy, in using the media and the fame that comes with it to make the case for being left alone by the media. The episode isn't anti-Harry or anti-Meghan in any simple political sense. It's using their specific situation to make a broader point about the nature of celebrity and its relationship to the concept of privacy, about how fame and privacy are fundamentally incompatible in the way that the episode's protagonists seem to want to combine them. The episode generated a lot of attention and discussion, much of which was in the political register of are you pro or anti the Sussex family's decisions, which is a somewhat less interesting framing than the actual question the episode was asking. The actual question, which is whether it's coherent to simultaneously claim fame as a resource and privacy as a right and use each one to obtain more of the other, is more interesting and more universal than the specific political debate about Harry and Meghan suggests. That's a pattern you can observe across the entire history of South Park's celebrity satire. The specific target generates headlines. The actual question the episode is asking is almost always broader than the target. The show uses the famous person as a hook, as a way to get your attention and give the argument a concrete face. But the argument is almost never only about the person, it's always also about the culture that created them, the audience that consumes them, the system that produces the specific kind of ego being examined. This is worth understanding as a viewer because it changes how you experience the episodes. If you watch the Kanye episode as an episode about Kanye, you come away thinking about whether Kanye is self-aware. If you watch it as an episode about the nature of extreme ego and the specific perceptual distortions it creates, you come away thinking about something much larger, something that you can find examples of everywhere you look if you know what you're looking for. That's the gift of good satire. It gives you a pair of glasses that you keep wearing after the joke is over. I want to spend a little time on something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about South Park's celebrity episodes, which is the question of timing. Because the speed at which Parker and Stone operate is not just a logistical achievement, it's a creative philosophy. The show's ability to respond to something that happened this week, to be on television with a coherent, layered, artistically considered response within 6 days, is not just impressive. It changes what the response can be and what it means. When an episode about Mel Gibson airs 3 weeks after The Passion of the Christ opened in theaters, it catches something that slower forms of cultural criticism can't. The moment is still live. The feelings are still raw. The cultural conversation is still happening in real time, and the episode joins it in real time. The conversation about what that film meant, what it was doing, what kind of audiences it was reaching, and why, that conversation was happening everywhere in March of 2004. And South Park's entry into it 3 weeks after the film opened was not commentary on a past event. It was participation in an ongoing one. That's different from what happens when a long-form piece appears 6 months after the thing it's about, or a book appears 2 years later. And those things have their own value, their own depth, their own ability to see things that immediate response can't. But they're not in the moment. They're not catching the feeling in the air, and the feeling in the air is often where the most honest truth lives before it's been processed and contextualized and placed in the broader historical record. South Park's celebrity episodes, at their best, catch the feeling in the air. They land when the target is most alive in the culture. when the question being asked is most urgent, when the thing being examined has not yet been smoothed over by time and retrospect. That's why so many of them feel so exact. Not because Parker and Stone have access to better information than anyone else, but because they're responding in the same moment everyone else is responding, with all the same information, and they're responding more honestly and more precisely than almost everyone else. There's a particular quality to watching an episode that landed perfectly in its moment years after the fact. There's something almost archaeological about it. You're watching the thing that the culture felt then, preserved. The Britney Spears episode in 2008 is a perfect example. Watching it now, knowing what happened subsequently, knowing the full arc of her story, it feels both more painful and more impressive. It caught something true about what was happening to her in 2008 that a lot of other cultural commentary that year didn't catch. It named the structure of the thing, the ritual quality of the media's relationship to her breakdown, in a way that took the rest of the culture years to catch up to. And that's the thing about accuracy in satire. It ages well. The jokes that were just mean, the ones that were just going after an easy target with nothing deeper behind the joke, those age badly. They feel like cruelty without purpose in retrospect. But the episodes that identified something true and named it precisely, those feel better with time, not worse, because the truth they identified doesn't expire. If anything, it deepens. The best episodes of this particular strand of South Park are part of the historical record of what certain famous people represented at certain moments. They're documents, not flattering documents certainly, documents written by people who were willing to say the uncomfortable thing and take the consequences, but documents with real value, real content, and real information about what the culture was doing and what famous people meant and what our relationship to fame was saying about us. And they're funny. Don't let me undersell the funny. They're genuinely, consistently, sometimes transcendently funny in ways that hold up. The Fishsticks joke is a great joke. Mecha-Streisand is a great image. Tom Cruise in the closet is a great bit. The craft of the comedy is as real as everything else, as real as the satirical content, as real as the observations driving the jokes. Parker and Stone are funny writers, deeply funny. And that comedy is not separate from the insight, it's the vehicle for it. The insight wouldn't land without the laugh. The laugh wouldn't last without the insight. They're the same thing, inseparable, doing their work together. That's always been the promise of South Park. Or really, not just that it would say the things other shows wouldn't say, though it has done that. Not just that it would be offensive, though it has been that too. The promise is that it would be honest, specifically, particularly, precisely honest, about the culture it's living in, about the people shaping that culture, about the relationship between fame and truth, and what we need from our public figures and what we do to them. That promise has been delivered on again and again across the celebrity episodes we've spent tonight walking through. From Barbra Streisand in 1998 to the worldwide privacy tour in 2023. From kaiju to Fishsticks. From a man hiding in a closet to a man swimming with fish. Same question every time. What happens to the ego when fame gets hold of it? How large can it grow? How far from reality can it drift? And what does a person look like when the gap between who they think they are and who they actually are finally becomes visible? I hope you've enjoyed spending this evening with these episodes and the ideas inside them. There's more South Park lore to get into, more layers to this show than any one video can cover. There are the political episodes, which form their own extraordinary body of work. The religious episodes, which go places that almost no other piece of popular entertainment has gone. The character arcs, which in recent seasons have become genuinely moving in ways that the show's early reputation for pure shock value doesn't quite prepare you for. There are the Tegrity Farms seasons and the COVID specials and the long, strange, this surprisingly emotional arc of Randy Marsh becoming one of television's most interesting middle-aged protagonists. But for tonight, the celebrity ego episodes are where we've been. And it's been good, I think. It's been worth the time. Because what you've been listening to is not just the story of a cartoon making fun of famous people. It's the story of a show that built something rare and kept it for 30 years. A place where the truth about power could still be said. Where no ego was big enough to be safe. Where the specific and absurd and precisely observed comedy was also, almost always, also the most honest thing around. And that, I think, is worth celebrating. What I find most interesting about all of this, sitting with it at a distance, is how consistent the show's relationship to its celebrity targets has been across time. Not in the sense that every episode is the same, because they're obviously not. The Britney Spears episode and the Kanye episode are making completely different points and have completely different emotional textures. The Tom Cruise episode and the Mel Gibson episode are arriving at their targets from completely different angles. But underneath all of them, there's a consistency of purpose that you can feel even when you can't quite articulate it. The show is never making fun of someone just for the sake of making fun of them, or to put it more precisely, when it seems like it might be doing that. When an episode appears on the surface to be straightforward mockery, there's almost always something underneath it that's doing something more considered. You have to sometimes look twice. You have to sometimes let the episode sit for a moment after it's over and ask yourself what it was actually doing, what it was actually saying, why this particular target was chosen at this particular moment. But if you do that, you usually find something. The consistency of purpose is this. South Park's celebrity episodes are always about the relationship between fame and reality. About the specific ways in which being famous distorts a person's relationship to truth. About the ego as a kind of armor that protects the person inside it from having to hear certain things, and about what it looks like from the outside when that armor has grown so thick that the person inside it can no longer hear anything at all. That's a conversation that the show has been having with the culture for nearly 30 years. And the culture has been answering it, sometimes in the show's favor and sometimes against it, but always engaged. The celebrities themselves have answered it with blog posts and lawsuits and silence and songs that reference Fishsticks. The media has answered it by covering the show's controversies and by re-airing the Fishsticks episode for 2 hours straight on the day that seemed most relevant. The audience has answered it by watching, by laughing, by making these episodes part of the cultural vocabulary. And the show has kept going. It keeps finding new targets, new egos, new versions of the old questions. The pace of celebrity culture has accelerated enormously since 1997. Fame is cheaper now and more abundant. There are more famous people than there have ever been in the technical sense that fame means having a large audience, and many of them are famous in ways that would have seemed incomprehensible in 1997. Famous for videos on platforms that didn't exist when the show launched. Famous for things that aren't performances in any traditional sense. Famous just for being watched. And South Park has adapted to all of that. It's taken the same analytical framework, the same commitment to finding the specific truth and following it to its extreme, and applied it to new kinds of fame. The later seasons are full of commentary on influencer culture, on social media celebrity, on the way attention and validation and follower counts create their own specific flavors of ego distortion. The questions are the same, the targets are newer. There's something almost cyclical about the whole thing, which is that each new form of celebrity produces the same essential problem that every previous form of celebrity produced, which is the problem of feedback loops, the problem of being surrounded by people whose financial or social interest is in confirming your self-image rather than challenging it. The problem of living in a world that tells you you're exceptional often enough that you start to believe the exceptions that apply to everyone else don't apply to you. The Fishsticks joke is not actually about fish sticks. It's about the specific loneliness of being so convinced of your own greatness that you can't share in the simplest human experience of being in on a joke, of being part of the laughter, of being a person among persons rather than a genius among admirers. The peace that Kanye finds at the bottom of the ocean, swimming with fish who have never heard of him, is the peace of that loneliness finally ending, which is both funny and genuinely sad if you let yourself feel both of those things at once. And that's the thing South Park does at its best that almost nothing else does in quite the same way. It makes you feel the funny and the sad and the true at the same time, simultaneously, in a single image or a single joke or a single absurd scenario. It doesn't separate them out. It doesn't say, here is the clever part and here is the heart. It puts them all in the same moment and trusts you to hold them together. That's a rare creative gift. And it's never been more consistently on display than in the episodes we've spent tonight with. The celebrity ego episodes. For the ones where South Park looked at the most famous people in the world and saw something true about them, and had the nerve and the craft and the commitment to say it. There's one more thing worth noting before we fully close out tonight, and it's about the show's relationship to its own legacy in this area. South Park has been running long enough now that the celebrities it satirized in its early seasons have had their own full arcs, their own subsequent stories, their own places in the historical record. And looking back at those early episodes from the vantage point of everything that came after is a genuinely interesting exercise. Barbra Streisand, first mocked in 1998, is still a living legend, still releasing music and performing and advocating for causes she believes in. The kaiju version of her that appeared in South Park Season 1, and then again in the show's 200th episode, is a piece of pop culture history at this point. It's funnier in retrospect than it was at the time, partly because Streisand has outlasted the mockery by such a wide margin. The episode wanted to say something about ego and cultural hunger and the drive for permanent significance. And then the subject of that episode went ahead and had a career so long and so successful that the original satire became almost affectionate over time. Tom Cruise's relationship to the episode about him is more complicated and more ongoing. The questions the episode raised about his relationship to Scientology and to criticism have remained questions. The man has continued to be one of the most famous actors in the world, and has continued to define himself largely through his work and his image management, and has continued to generate the kind of fascinated cultural attention that makes him an endlessly interesting celebrity. The Closet episode hasn't aged into affection in the way the Streisand episode has. It stayed pointed. The questions it was asking are still live questions, and Kanye West's story, which is still being written, has taken turns since the Fishsticks episode that the episode didn't predict, but that feel, watching it again now, like they were somehow implicit in what the episode described. The ego that couldn't understand a Fishsticks joke in 2009 became, in the years that followed, an ego that generated a remarkable amount of pain for the people closest to it, and controversy for everyone watching from further away. The trajectory the episode identified didn't change, it intensified. The diagnosis was accurate, and the prognosis in retrospect was bleaker than the gay fish song made it seem. But the song was still beautiful, and the episode was still right, and the show kept going. These are the things I think about when I think about what South Park's celebrity satire has actually been. Not just a series of funny episodes about famous people, a kind of sustained, ongoing, uncommonly honest cultural conversation, a place where the truth about fame and ego and the human cost of both was being said in 6-day cycles for 30 years. By two people from Colorado who started with a short film about Jesus and Santa Claus fighting and ended up making something that will be studied and argued about and laughed at and grimaced at for as long as anyone is writing about the television of this era. That's something. That's genuinely something. And now, at last, it really is time to settle in and let the night take over. The stories are told. The episodes are walked through, the questions have been asked, and if not fully answered, at least carefully examined. You know more about Mecha-Streisand and gay fish and closets and harvest rituals and photoshopped hobbits and giant excrement records than you did when you started. Whether that information will come up at a dinner party is uncertain, but you have it now. Let the images drift. The kaiju downtown, the ocean at night, and something swimming in it that used to be enormous and famous and terrifying and is now just a fish, free among fish. That's a good thing to fall asleep to. I think so anyway. One thing that gets overlooked when people talk about South Park's relationship to the celebrities it has targeted is how infrequently those celebrities have managed to genuinely surprise it. The show predicted, or perhaps more accurately identified, something in its subjects that then played out exactly as described. This is not coincidence, and it is not luck. It is the product of paying attention, of looking very carefully at a specific person and finding the specific load-bearing element of their public persona, the thing that if it shifted or broke would cause everything else to shift or break with it. The load-bearing element in Kanye West was the ego's relationship to the perception of others. The need to be seen in a particular way that was so consuming it prevented him from being able to see himself from any other angle. That's what the Fishsticks episode identified. And that element did shift or crack or in some ways amplify in the years that followed. And the results were everything the episode implied they might be. Not funny anymore by the time you reach certain points in the subsequent story, but recognizable, consistent with the original diagnosis. The load-bearing element in Tom Cruise was the relationship between projected confidence and internal fragility. The way the enormous machine of a successful Hollywood career and a famous public persona sits on top of something that cannot tolerate a mild review from an 11-year-old boy. That element has remained. The machine has kept running. The fragility has remained fragile. The episode is still accurate. The load-bearing element in Barbra Streisand was something that is actually quite sympathetic when you think about it calmly. The desire to matter, to leave something behind, to be remembered, to have your name mean something after you're gone. That is not an ignoble desire, it is a human desire. But in the episode's logic, when that desire is taken to its extreme, when it becomes something that has to be fed at any cost, it becomes monstrous. The monster was always latent in the very human thing underneath. South Park just showed you what it looks like when it gets out. That might be the most honest and most compassionate thing the show has ever said about celebrity ego. And it said it in the first season in an episode about a kaiju version of a famous singer, which is the kind of sentence that makes perfect sense if you've been paying attention tonight. Every famous person in the show's history of celebrity satire started with something real, something recognizable, something that was there before the fame and that the fame magnified and distorted until it became something else, the ambition, the need for validation, the certainty that their work matters, that they matter, that the world should know they were here. These are not celebrity pathologies, they are human ones. They live in all of us to some degree. The show just has access to subjects whose versions of these qualities are large enough to be clearly visible. And that's the final thing worth carrying with you as tonight winds down. When the show makes you laugh at a celebrity's ego, it is also quietly making you laugh at something in yourself. The part that can't hear certain truths, the part that builds false memories, the part that wants to be the most important person in the room, the part that would rather live at the bottom of the ocean with fish who have no expectations than come up and face the world and its relentlessly honest jokes. That part of you, the part that knows the Fishsticks joke is about something close to home. South Park has always known it was there, and it has always been polite enough not to say so directly. It just makes the joke and trusts you to do the rest. Good night again, and this time, really, sweet dreams.